And now Stephen Ball's going to show you how you can build into your RAD server modules documentation APIs using YAML. Stephen's also going to show you how the Thing Connect heart rate monitor can be integrated into your RAD server to collect data. So Stephen, let's show people what you can do with embedded documentation for the APIs in a RAD server.
Thanks, David. I'm going to be looking through at the new features within the RAD server to create auto-generated documentation for the APIs that you're sharing through your REST server. Now, this is a really cool feature of EMS, the RAD server, and I'm going to take you through the kind of key elements. So we're working with some industry standard features here, which then allow some very cool quick connectivity into other programming languages as well. One of the key elements here is Swagger. Now, Swagger, or Swagger.io, if you want to go and visit the website there, basically is a tool that you can use to read YAML. YAML is kind of a subset of JSON. It's kind of a description language that goes beyond kind of what JSON offers, but it documents your API. And using YAML, you're able to import the YAML documentation, and it's quite human readable, into Swagger, and then using Swagger UI or the Swagger editor, you can then see what the documentation looks like. Now, that documentation can then be used through Swagger to generate SDKs for client libraries for a whole host of different programming languages, including JavaScript and Android Java and Xcode and iOS and Scala and PHP, Flash, a whole host of different client-side classes can be generated from that YAML documentation through Swagger, and which you can then use to connect into your RESTful API very quickly. Now, this is kind of a similar kind of thing to the way that you have the mobile connectors through DataSnap, but way more. So really, really exciting. So if you want to play around with Swagger, just go to swagger.io. You'll find the links there, but the key place to get to is really GitHub, and on the GitHub repository for Swagger-API /Swagger-UI. And then it took me a moment to work out where I needed to go really, but the key thing is if you go to the download zip, and once you've downloaded that, you don't need to do the building or anything else like that. You can just use what's in the redist folder and the redistribution folder to be able to run a local copy of Swagger UI. And you need to run it locally on your machine, so it's then within the domain to be able to connect to your REST server to then be able to get the full two-way interaction with it, which we're going to have a look at. So there's three key attributes that you need to look for, and then two additional ones that help kind of supplement it and make it a lot richer. So the first three is the endpoint request summary. The endpoint request summary kind of gives a high-level picture of what the API does. You can use it to categorize the API, and then the parameters, which you can then use to define the parameters that are going to be available for the API. And this is really important to declare those with specific attributes so that they're then they then become automatically discoverable through Swagger. And then finally, there's details and responses, so you can define what responses you're going to get from the API. What does a 404 mean? What does a 201 mean? You can define exactly what you're going to get sent back, and that response could also include structures, and those structures you can define globally and then just put a reference point to them in, so you don't have to declare them time and time and time again. And that's really where the endpoint objects, YAML definitions or JSON definitions come in. So using the YAML definitions and JSON definitions, you can define up a structure for your objects, and that goes beyond kind of the JSON name value pair. Using YAML, you can actually define up specific types that are going to be returned back. So it becomes a lot richer, and you can say you're going to get this object and it's going to have this value, and that value is going to be a string, or it's going to be an integer, or it's going to be of a specific type, which is then declared as well. So it gives a lot richer return on the documentation. Now, if you want to kind of read in a bit more about that afterwards, then I've got a blog post at delphiabort.co.uk/2016/04/22/swagger-YAML-Delphi. And although it's the same for Delphi and C++, that's there on my blog. So let's have a look at the existing EMS server structure. So you have your EMS server, and you then have an EMS client, and that client calls through REST calls to the EMS server. And you can have obviously multiple clients, they're calling to EMS server. Now, one of those calls that can be made is obviously for the documentation now. And to do that, you call /API/ and then either API doc.json or API doc.yaml. And let's go and have a look at that running. So under the sample projects, and they're here for both C++ and Object Pascal, under database, under EMS, you'll find API doc attributes, sample, and if we go ahead and open up the package here, we can see this is just connecting to employee database table and fetching some data back, which it's then pushing out through a get call. The implementation for that in here is now documented by a few additional attributes that have been added on. So if we just scroll down here, we can see all of them. The first one is the endpoint request summary, saying this is under category of sample tag, and then with the title, description, etc. being passed in. There's also the endpoint request parameter. This one here is called skip, and that allows us to define a query. Here we can see if it's a part of the path, if it's a query, if it's a header, a body, or part of the form data. So here this is forming part of the query, which becomes a kind of question mark on the URL. And then kind of the additional properties define if it's a number, if it's an int32, for example. And there's also the response details. So here we're saying this is response 200, which is OK. And this is returning back an object, and that object is defined as definitions employee table. If we go and have a look at the top here, rather than defining the employee table on every single one of the methods, we can go to the endpoint object YAML definitions, and if we just control click the constant that's here. So here we can see the constant that's been defined to tell out the structure of what's being passed back. Now, quite honestly, the quickest way to do this is just to run it once and then execute it, see the data that comes back, and then just take the values out of that. That's a quick way that I've done that in the past. But you can then build up here exactly what it is, the different classes and how they're defined and what they reference. So here, this table object actually references the item object. You can actually work with some of this straight out of the example. So what that gives us as we go ahead and run this server, if we open the browser now, we can see that we're running version 2.1. Let's just go /API. We can see we have endpoints for API doc.yaml. And if we just do API doc.yaml, here we can now see the YAML documentation, which is pretty readable, defining what's in there. Let's just copy that, and I'm going to go ahead and open up my Swagger UI that I downloaded. And I'm just going to go, for some reason just needs to disable it and enable it when I open up the page for the first time. I've got a cross-origin resource sharing plugin for Chrome here that allows me to then explore the documentation. So here's my EMS API documentation that's been imported from that YAML document. And here we can see the sample tag and the get. And here we can see an example which is defined from the constant that we had a look at earlier. We can see the skip that's defined. If we hit try it out, we can see the response come back and the data. And if we put kind of skip 5 and hit try it out, we can see now that that's appended as a parameter on the end because it's a query parameter, so working really, really well. And it's got the type defined here as well. So that's pretty cool. You know, the whole documentation is explorable here. We can go and explore the groups that are defined as part of EMS server. We can see all the attributes and everything limited in there as well. So really careful, also easy to use documentation through Swagger. So let's just close this, and I'm going to open up another document, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment. I just want to jump back to where we are. This is now obviously the original EMS server. Now obviously with thing points being added in, what becomes really cool is as you add a thing point, obviously it's connected to devices, that self-registers with the EMS server. We can add in a few more thing points and see those register up. These thing points, as they get added, the last thing you want to have to do is update this EMS server to declare the documentation for them. What EMS server actually does is it allows you to query the EMS server, and by exposing then the edge points, or the edge modules that are connected in, the thing points, you can then query the documentation for those and find out what this is connected to, what this is connected to, what APIs this one's exposing. And then that can then be fed back into EMS server and back to the client. So without having to change the EMS server, you can put the core functionality in here, and you can even write methods that will then go through the connected specific servers that support specific APIs to fetch and consolidate something and send it back. That's all possible here. Let's go and run the ThingPoint demo. Now I have been in and just made sure that the documentation has been added in, even in its basic form here. So I'm going to go ahead and run my local ThingPoint server. And let's go ahead and run my ThingPoint out to my remote machine. So here, let's just minimize these slides. I'm just going to open up my PA server. I want to confirm my port, my IP address 192.168.144.1, and this is connecting to 192.168.144.138. So yep, that's still correct. And I'm going to call this my Mac and activate my Edge module, and yeah, let's just go write that in. So what I've got now, if I go ahead and open up my Swagger index, and let's just make sure that this is enabled okay, and let's go to take my YAML documentation. What we have here now is my Edge modules, and if I go and select, I can see here what's going to be sent back. Let's go and try this out, and here I can now find my Edge module. So I've got my Mac, and let's just close the Edge module part up here and actually have a look at the invocation. In fact, let's just go. I can go and find what resources are available. Now I know it's called measurements, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the get here and execute, and I've got no data returned back. So let's go ahead and collect some data into here and try this out now, and we can now see that we've got the specific data come back directly from that edge point, which is pretty cool. So without having to change my EMS server, my thing point's registered. I can find out what's going on with it, and I can find out quite happily through it here. If I go ahead and put down Edge modules, and my Edge module here is called my Mac, I can then find out through the Swagger UI. I'm just going to shortcut that process here to call the API, api.yaml, and let's go ahead now and using Swagger here, explore that. So here I can see I've got measurements, and I can also call detailed. So if I go ahead and try that out, I can now see that I'm getting the additional detail back, which is pretty cool. So all of this has been discoverable without having to write any additional code on our EMS server. So that's pretty much it for the documentation side. Very powerful, very useful, and look forward to hearing about what you do with your YAML and what you're getting it connected up to in the future.
So thanks for that great presentation and demonstration, Stephen.